Merry Christmas. Is it? Really? It's a season of hope, right? Christmas is a season of hope. So how's your hope holding up? I think we have created an unintentional corrosion of our hope, and we've done it. We've done it from the time that we are children by setting the expectations for this season so unrealistically. As children, we have unrealistic expectations about how we're going to experience this season, how we're going to experience Christmas Day. When I was growing up, we had expectations about everything. The people who would be there, the things that would happen. We had expectations of the weather. And you know what happens when you have high expectations, like that little goal of peace on earth, goodwill toward men. When you set those kind of expectations, and those expectations go unmet, it discourages us, it disappoints us, and it chips away at our confidence in our hope. We don't mean to have that happen. But the interesting thing about this season of hope is that our hope is actually challenged more in this season than in any other season. You see, our expectations are things that we live with. It's part of the human experience. And we amplify those expectations at this season, but we're born into a world where expectations kind of set the goals for us and set our dreams and kind of focus our hopes. And so expectations are not wrong. They're part of the life journey that we're all on. Everyone has expectations. The question is, what do we do when our expectations are unmet? And does it begin to corrupt our hope? When our expectations in others are unmet, when our expectations of this season are unmet, when our expectations of God are unmet. Like, God, I thought I'd be doing better by now. I thought life would be easier than it is. I thought that things would not be as difficult as they are. I expected more from you, God. Why is it that bad things happen to good people? I don't understand. This is a question that people have asked throughout human history. Since people have asked questions, they've asked the question about unmet expectations and about why bad things happen to good people and why bad people seem to prosper. 2,500 years ago, there was a songwriter. His name was Asaph. And Asaph was the director of the choir in Solomon's temple. And he wrote a song. It's not a Christmas song, but it's a song about the struggle to find hope in the midst of unmet expectations. It's the 73rd Psalm, and this is what Asaph said. Truly God is good to Israel, to those whose hearts are pure. But as for me, I almost lost my footing. My feet were slipping, and I was almost gone. For I envied the proud when I saw them prosper despite their wickedness. They seem to live such painless lives. Their bodies are so healthy and strong. They don't have troubles like other people. They're not plagued with problems like everyone else. They wear pride like a jeweled necklace and clothe themselves with cruelty. These fat cats have everything their hearts could wish for. They scoff and speak only evil. In their pride, they seek to crush others. They boast against the very heavens, and their words strut throughout the earth. And so the people are dismayed and confused, drinking in all their words. What does God know, they ask? Does the Most High even know what's happening? Look at these wicked people enjoying a life of ease while their riches multiply. Did I keep my heart pure for nothing? Did I keep myself innocent for no reason? I get nothing but trouble all day long. Every morning brings me pain. Merry Christmas. Wow. Okay, Dave, thanks for bringing the darkness. on this holiday, but I want to suggest to you that this is the time when we need a hope that will endure. And that a hope that is not tested is not a hope worth having. And that in a season of unmet expectations, in a season that is supposed to be a season of hope, the hope that we have is a hope worth having. Last week we began our consideration of the Christmas season by reflecting on the soundtrack of the holidays, by thinking about the famous Christmas carols that form the audio backdrop for our experiences during the Christmas season. And today, I want us to reflect on my personal favorite Christmas carol of all time. A Christmas carol that wrestles with the reality of unmet expectations and clings to an enduring hope. It is a Christmas carol called "I Heard the Bells on Christmas Day." But before we reflect on that, would you pray with me? Father in heaven, I would ask that the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart would be pleasing in your sight, that you would use your words spoken by your servant, anointed by your Spirit to strengthen our hope. Pray that for myself and for my family and for all of us here, and for anyone who will encounter this place or these people or this message. For we ask this together in Jesus' name. Amen. The first 3 days in July of 1863 were some of the most tragic in the history of this nation. It was the days when the armies of Robert E. Lee and of the Army of Northern Virginia pursued the Army of the Potomac, the Union Army, into the fields outside of a small town in Pennsylvania called Gettysburg. Over the course of those 3 days, over 51,000 American men would be wounded or killed. There were over 8,500 Union soldiers that were killed and 9,500 Confederate soldiers who were killed or missing at the end of the Battle of Gettysburg, a full 1/3 of Robert E. Lee's army. It was perhaps one of the darkest days in American history. 4 months prior to this, there was a young man who lived in Cambridge, Massachusetts. He was 17 years old, and his name was Charles. And Charles decided to run away from home and enlist in the Union Army. He left and left his father a note. His father should have seen this coming because his father was an outspoken abolitionist. But Charles wrote this note and left it for his father, saying this: "I have tried hard to resist the temptation of going without your leave, but I cannot any longer. I feel it to be my first duty to do what I can for my country, and I would be willing to lay down my life for it if it would be of any good." Young Charles joined the 1st Massachusetts Infantry and proved himself to be an excellent soldier, and by the fall of 1863, he had been promoted and commissioned as a lieutenant in the 1st Massachusetts Artillery. On the dates between November 27th and December 6th, the Union Army, under the leadership of George McClellan, pursued the Army of Northern Virginia of Robert E. Lee into Orange County, Virginia. And over the 4 days at the end of November and the beginning of December, there was a battle called the Mine Run Campaign. The first battle was called the Battle of New Hope Church on November 27th. It was during that battle that young Charles was severely wounded. He was carried to a triage in the New Hope Church, and he survived his injuries, but they were serious enough that he was put on a train bound for Washington for further treatment. It was at dinner on December 1st, around their dining room table, that Charles' father and his 5 brothers and sisters received a telegram informing them of his wound and that he was being transported to Washington, D.C. The next day, his father gathered together his youngest brother, Ernest, and they traveled to Washington, D.C. They met the medical train as it brought these soldiers to the hospital, and Charles' father met the surgeon who informed him that his injuries were in fact very severe. He had been shot in the left chest, and the bullet had gone through his chest, nicked his spine, and exited out under his right shoulder blade. The surgeon was optimistic that young Charles would live, but he was afraid that the spinal injury would leave him paralyzed for the rest of his life. And in 1863, that was a virtual death sentence. The young soldier's name was Charles Appleton Longfellow. His father was Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, perhaps the greatest literary scholar and American poet of his generation. It was on Christmas Day of 1863 that Henry Longfellow heard the bells chiming in the streets on Christmas Day. And at his son's bedside, he wrote the words of the poem, "I Heard the Bells." Perhaps you're familiar with it. I heard the bells on Christmas Day, their old familiar carols play, and wild and sweet the words repeat of peace on earth, goodwill toward men. And thought how, as the day had come, the belfries of all Christendom had rolled along the unbroken song of peace on earth, goodwill toward men. Till ringing, singing on its way, the world revolved from day to day, a voice, a chime, a chant sublime of peace on earth, goodwill toward men. Then from its black, accursed mouth, a cannon thundered in the south, and with the sound, the carols drown of peace on earth, goodwill toward men. It was as if an earthquake rent the hearthstones of a continent and made forlorn the households born of peace on earth, goodwill toward men. We don't typically sing the fourth and the fifth stanzas of Longfellow's poem, but when we read them, we realize the struggle he was in the midst of. As he sat at the bedside of his critically wounded oldest son, he recognized the violence and the brutality that was tearing his nation apart. It's not difficult for us to speculate on that Christmas day, while he may have had thankfulness that his son had survived and hope that he would recover, he realized that in that same moment, there were literally hundreds of thousands of families on that same Christmas day who were staring at an empty chair and a vacant space of where a son or a father or a brother or a nephew or an uncle or a cousin or a neighbor or a friend would normally be. He understood what I think we all understand, that life can be unfair, that life can be unjust, and that the challenge of our hope is to endure the difficult darkness of unmet expectations and of the weight of the struggle of life. We are all familiar with that. There's none of us who gets out of this life unscathed. In fact, I have no doubt that there are those of you here today, and I have talked to some of you already today, who are bearing unbearable weight of tragedies that you are reminded of in this season, that the tragedy is acute for you. So it's not hard for you to understand the words that Longfellow wrote when he wrote the sixth stanza. And he said, "And in despair I bowed my head. There is no peace on earth," I said, "for hate is strong, and it mocks the song of peace on earth, goodwill toward men." Henry Longfellow was a man who was familiar with the struggle. Even though he was one of the most well-respected literary experts of his generation, his life had been difficult. He was born in 1807 in Portland, Maine, and he was a frail and awkward child. He was bookish. And even though he was wildly creative and incredibly intelligent, his social skills were somewhat lacking. People were actually surprised, not that he became a professor at Harvard, but that he found a wife. But in 1835, his wife, Mary Potter Longfellow, tragically died from the complications of a miscarriage with their first child. It was in the summer of 1836, the next year, that Longfellow traveled to Europe to get away from Boston and Cambridge, to get out of the environment and the memory of the loss of his wife. And he was studying in Thun, Switzerland, when he met another family from Boston, the Appleton family. Nathan Appleton was a famous Boston industrialist, and he was traveling through Europe with his wife and his two children, his son Thomas and his daughter Frances. His daughter Frances, no one called her Frances, everyone called her Franny because she was so strong-willed and so independent. At a young age, she announced that she did not need a man in her life. She had no intention of marrying, and she was going to be, as a woman, as successful an industrialist as her father had been. This was 1835. She was like Jo from Little Women, and everyone regarded her as a firebrand and an outspoken woman, and Longfellow met her and was instantly smitten. He went to her father and said, "May I court young Frances?" And he basically said, "Good luck with that." When they returned to Boston, he would make it a habit of walking the 90 minutes from his home in Cambridge across the West Boston Bridge to the Appleton residence in Beacon Hill. And he would sit in the parlor of the Appleton home just on the hope that Franny would stop by and have a brief conversation with him. Day after day, he would walk 90 minutes each way to sit in the parlor. In fact, the bridge that goes across what was called the West Boston Bridge was rebuilt and renamed in 1927. It is now called the Longfellow Bridge. He did that for 3 years. He wrote to a friend in 1839 and he said, "Hope yet remains. She says she shall not, I say she shall." And he said, "This is not my pride from which I speak, but the madness of passion." He courted her for another 4 years. 7 years he waited. On May the 10th, 1843, he received a note at his residence in Cambridge. It was from Frances. And it said, "I have decided to allow you to marry me." He called for a carriage, and immediately, as the carriage was delayed in coming, he began his walk and walked there in record time, entering the parlor, holding up the note, saying, "Is this true?" She said, "Yes." They were married as quickly as possible, and they went on to have 6 children together, the oldest of which was Charles Appleton Longfellow. It was in July of 1835, it was in July of 1861 that Frances, Mrs. Longfellow, was curling the hair of your youngest daughter, Annie. As was the custom of the day, the girls wore their hair in tight curls, and to set the curls, you would have to heat a curling iron over a candle. While she was curling her daughter's hair, no one really knows how it happened, the candle fell onto the floor under Mrs. Longfellow's petticoat. And the fabric was so flammable that it instantly exploded in flames. By the time she realized that her dress was on fire, she was engulfed. She fell to the floor, and Annie and Frances screamed, and their screams awoken Henry, who was taking a nap down the hall. He ran to his daughter's room, and you can only imagine the horror that he saw when he opened the door. He grabbed a rug and threw it over his wife, and when that failed to fully extinguish the flames, he threw his own body on top of her, so badly burning his chest and his neck and his face that he remained in the hospital for 2 weeks. Frances died the next day. He was unable to attend her funeral. He was a man who was familiar with the struggle. And on Christmas Day in 1863, as he sat at the bedside of his seriously wounded son, still carrying the scars on his face that he would hide with a full beard for the rest of his life, but the scars on his heart that he said never healed because he was always inwardly bleeding to death. Sitting at his son's bedside, he wrote of the struggle with hope. That is, I heard the bells on Christmas Day. But the poem does not end in hopelessness. The final stanza of I Heard the Bells says, I heard the bells, they pealed more loud and deep. God is not dead, nor doth he sleep. The wrong shall fail, the right prevail. With peace on earth, goodwill to men. How do you do that? How do we do that? When it seems as all of our expectations are unmet, when our hopes and our dreams are unfulfilled, when the weight of the struggle of life threatens to crush us where we stand, how do we hold on to our hope? As I reflect on the words of Longfellow, I reflect on the things that I try to do to sustain my hope when I feel as if the injustices and the weight of the world would crush me. And there's two things that I try to do, and one thing that I try to remember. The first thing that I try to do is I try to be honest about the reality of the struggle that I am facing. I try to be brutally honest about it. And I don't know if you're like me, but I have a tendency to process the struggle of life at the extremes. The way I was taught to process the difficulties of life is, don't let them get you down. It's no big deal. My father used to say, just rub some dirt on it, you'll be fine. You fall off the horse, what do? You get right back on. You will survive. You will get through it. And at the one extreme, I was taught to kind of downplay the significance of the weight. I was instructed, and I've become very good at sort of pushing aside the reality of the pain. But in those occasions when I can't do that, I venture to the other extreme, where I imagine that I am bearing a weight that no one else has ever borne, that I am carrying sorrow unlike any other person. Oh, woe is me. Nobody knows the trouble I've seen. And I live at these extremes, but if I want to have a hope that matters, that sustains me, I have to try to remember to be brutally honest about the weight, because the pain is real. And the struggle is difficult. It really is. But it's just as wrong to think that it will destroy you, that no one has ever survived such a great weight. The idea is to be brutally honest about the struggle that I am in. Because if I'm not honest about the struggle that I am in, then the hope that I have is not refined by seeing me through it. It's either too much or too little. The second thing that I try to do is I try to put my feet on the floor and stand. Because there are days when the wave of trouble overwhelms me, and I would just as soon pull the covers over my head and hide for a little while, believing that maybe when I finally do rise, the troubles will be over. It will have passed. But what I try to do when life gets hard is I try to put my feet on the ground and stand. It's what the hero does. It is the journey of the heroic. It is the task of the courageous to stand up and face the day, to not let the difficulties and the weight break us, but to put our feet in the ground and to stand. And it's in that moment that we realize that we are stronger than we know. That we have a resolve and an ability that we did not even know we had, but you cannot know what that is when you take on loads of self-pity or self-doubt, or you indulge in blame, and blame shifting and laying blame on others and trying to rearrange the pain. What I try to do is be honest about the weight of it. It's real, and the struggle is hard. And I try to put my feet in the ground and stand. And then there's one thing that I try to remember. And when I don't remember it, my wife reminds me of it. And that is that I am not alone in this struggle. Now, make no mistake, the journey of the weight of the tragedies and the difficulties of life is a lonely journey. I wish it were possible for us to be able to exchange pain. I wish that I could take the pain and the struggle away from those who are being demolished by it. People that I care about and people that I love, I wish that I could take their pain away. And there's times when I wish someone would come into my life and take the pain off of me, but that's not how it works. It's a lonely journey, but you are never alone on that journey. I know you are never alone because you are not the first person, and you will not be the last person to face what you're facing. In fact, in this room right now, there are many people who know what you are going through because they are going through it themselves. And there are many people who have faced what you have faced and survived. You are not alone. You are not the only one who has ever faced such hardship. And in addition to that, we have the uncompromising promise of God that I will never abandon you. I will never leave you or forsake you. Jesus reminds us of this in Matthew chapter 11, where he says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and beat down, all of you who are struggling with the weight of the world, all of you who are heavy laden and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, because I'm humble and I understand. I have been where you are. Because my yoke is easy and my burden is light, because my yoke is a shared device. I'm not putting a yoke on you that you carry alone. I'm putting a yoke on you that I will carry with you, and I will be with you in it." You see, the resilience of our hope, the integrity of our hope, the quality of our hope is proven by the source of our hope. And the stronger that source, the more resilient and enduring our hope. And it's in the unmet expectations, it's in the disappointments and the struggle of life that we find ourselves recognizing that our hope will see us through. And we will endure. As Charles Longfellow sat on the side of his oldest son's bed, and he penned the words of "I heard the bells," we can hear his pain in those words. We can see the reality of his struggle. Because he was familiar. He was familiar with the pain of life, the injustice of life. All he had to do was look out the window, and he saw his nation tearing itself apart. His hope was challenged at every side. He carried the burden of the loss of his wife for the rest of his life. 18 years after her death, he wrote a poem called Fallen Snow, which is a tribute to the loss of his wife 18 years after her death. And even though his son Charles fully recovered and he did not remain paralyzed, and he was discharged honorably from the Union Army and went on to live a full and productive life, in that moment, at that time, all he had was his hope. And I like to imagine that what he realized in that moment was that his hope would endure. That the bells he heard were ringing before the war, before the tragedies, that the bells had been ringing for 2,000 years. And the bells would be ringing after the tragedy subsides and after the war is over. For as long as we are on this planet, the bells will be ringing. The bells will endure. Our hope will endure. And so will I. Then pealed the bells more loud and deep. God is not dead, nor does he sleep. The wrong will fail, the right will prevail. With peace on earth, goodwill to men. The Civil War was the most horrific of days, of times. Do you realize that more American soldiers died in the Civil War than have died in every other American conflict since that time combined? It's estimated, and it's difficult to get the exact number because there were so many who died without death certificates, without acknowledgement, without ID. The number is somewhere between 620,000 and 750,000 casualties, wounded, dead, and missing during the 3 years, 362 days of the Civil War. And yet the bells continued to ring, and his hope was sustained. And this is the hope that sustains us when life seems to betray us, when the weight seems too great. And it has always been that kind of hope. It was that kind of hope 2,300 years before Longfellow wrote his song. Before he wrote his poem, the temple choir director, Asaph, came to the exact same conclusion as Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. The 73rd Psalm ends this way. When my heart was grieved and my spirit embittered, I was senseless and ignorant. I was a brute beast before you. Yet I am always with you. You hold me by my right hand. You guide me with your counsel. And afterward, you will take me into glory. Whom have I in heaven but you? And earth has nothing I desire beside you. My flesh and my heart may fail, but God is the strength of my heart and my portion forever. I understand that the unmet expectations that we have can corrode our hope, can challenge our confidence. When our expectations are unmet and we see the injustice of the world and we see good people suffer and our lives are weighted down with the burden of life, I understand the challenge that it presents to our hope. But a hope that is proven is a trustworthy hope. And if we can hold on to this hope in this season, then we can truly say it is a Merry Christmas.